Greetings, my friends. In this video I wanted to share my thoughts on another video called In Search for the Northern Soul by Morgoth. The video itself you can find on a channel called Morgoth's Review. It's a terrific channel, I can't recommend it enough, and I'll leave a link in the description box below. So the video was actually a Christmas special, and it was a more positive and heartwarming kind of content compared to what it usually can be found on his channel. I mean, some people would call him a blood pill merchant. I would actually disagree, but that's not important here. What's important is the topic of the video and the subsequent thoughts that I had after watching it on the day of its release around the last Christmas. The topic of the video, as one can deduct from the title, is basically contemplations on what constitutes a Northern European soul, what drives it, where it came from, what it aspires to, in which architectural, literary, artistic and musical forms it expresses itself, and so on and so forth. Honestly, just give it a go yourselves. The guy is very good with words, certainly a lot better than I will ever be, so just take it from the horse's mouth if you wish to get a better context of my further explorations. Being myself Russian, I couldn't help but to start wondering about the origins and nature of my own civilization and my own culture while watching his video. A lot of thoughts passed through my mind since then, and I decided to record my own take on what constitutes a Russian soul. To begin with, I think it might be necessary to give a little bit of context for my viewers, especially the Westerners, on what is Russia, where its origins lie, who Russians are, and so on. So, Russia is an Eastern European nation, a Slavic and an Orthodox nation. Its origins lie with the same numerous tribes which gave birth to such modern nations as Poland, Czechia, Serbia, Bulgaria and others. Unlike the Western Slavs that fell under the influence of the Latin West and Roman Catholicism, Eastern and Southern Slavs had a lot more closer ties with the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. In turn, these contacts brought us our religion, which is Greek Orthodoxy, and our writing system, the Cyrillic script. Basically, culturally, we are not too dissimilar from all the Orthodox nations of Eastern Europe. Interesting feature of the early Slavic history is the fact that Slavs were very often subjected to a foreign power in one way or another. From the time of the Great Migrations and the Hunnic invasions of Europe, Slavs were either a subject people to different nomadic lords or were trying to escape their domination, thus resulting in the Great Slavic Migration from the northeastern slopes of the Carpathian Mountains to all corners of Eastern and Central Europe, from northwestern Russia to eastern Germany, and as far south as Peloponnese. Yet, even in these new places, Slavs rarely created anything resembling a proper state, instead living independently or becoming subjects to some new overlords. Such was the case throughout most of the first millennia, from the 5th to the 10th century. First subjects to Huns, then Avars, Onagers, Bulgars, Magyars, Khazars, or Viking Rus. The first Slavic state was allegedly founded by a Frank called Samo in the 7th century. The first Bulgarian empire, despite what its name might imply to our modern viewer, was not a Slavic state, but a Turkic nomad horde. The first truly Slavic states appeared in Moravia in the 9th century and in Poland closer to the end of the first millennia. So much for context, hey? Took a bit longer than I expected, but I think it was necessary to establish the idea that Slavs were not too keen on forming proper states and advanced civilizations themselves. This is important to understand, because this particular feature is what in many ways differentiates the Russian mentality, Russian soul, from the Byzantine one, to which modern Russia can trace its cultural origins. Since I mentioned the Byzantines so many times, I think I have to explain what was the main idea behind their civilization and culture, and then compare it to Russia and its core idea. So, the Byzantines, or Eastern Romans as their second name implies, were the successors to the ancient Roman Empire. They saw themselves as Romans, they called themselves Romans, and their state and political system was an unbroken continuation of the Roman one. By any metrics, they were the Romans of the Middle Ages, and so it was reflected by their own understanding of the world and their place in it. No more an outgoing, conquering nation, they instead were the guardians of what was left of their civilization, or, in their opinion, the only civilization. Constantinople, or Nova Roma, New Rome, during most of the Middle Ages was the greatest city in Europe and arguably on Earth, comparable only to some Chinese capitals. To your average medieval peasant, the city was absolutely enormous, unimaginable. It was incredibly beautiful, magnificent, stunning. Its great churches and palaces had no competitors up until the late Renaissance era. The city was the shining beacon of civilization, culture, and learning. Vasilevusa, the queen of cities, as the capital was lovingly called in Greek, was herself a symbol. The Byzantine religion, Orthodoxy, was considered the only true faith, and their empire the only true empire that was in a covenant with God Himself. In their eyes, their kingdom was the kingdom of God. It wasn't an ethno-state, despite the fact that the majority of its population spoke Greek. The empire, as a concept, was an all-encompassing entity. The enormous dome of Hagia Sophia serves as a symbol of this idea, the one true, all-encompassing empire protected by God that stands alone as a monument to civilization and as an impenetrable citadel against barbarians and heathens. And so it stood for more than 1,000 years, enduring countless sieges and overcoming all sorts of odds, only succumbing to the Ottoman Turks and their gunpowder artillery in 1453. Russia, being a spiritual successor of the Byzantine Empire and the Orthodox religion, inherited many aspects of the Byzantines' understanding of the world and their place in it, yet mixed them with particular Slavic characteristics and circumstances, thus forming the Russian cultural spirit. While we, just as the Byzantines, considered ourselves a civilized nation surrounded by barbarians from all sides, we never considered ourselves the civilized empire. We never were an empire until the reign of Peter the Great, or arguably Ivan the Terrible, if you consider Tsardom an empire. We saw ourselves as one of the many nations touched by the light of God and the true religion. Yet, unlike the Byzantines, we were not necessarily his kingdom. Unlike the Byzantines, we never had a world-sprawling empire to which the true religion was revealed. We were ourselves, for most of our pre-Christian history, just a bunch of uncivilized savages, without writing, without proper law codes, without codified religion or proper statehood. And as I mentioned earlier, we were also more often than not subjects to some foreign power. In other words, there was nothing special about us in pre-Christian contexts. Only after our Viking Rus overlords accepted Christianity as their religion and assimilated into our wider Slavic society, a process not too dissimilar from what happened to Turkic Bulgars in the Balkans, only then we found ourselves a power in our own right, independent, yet painfully vulnerable. Being virtually a borderland with the Great Steppe, we were always subjected to either nomad dominance or nomad raids. Even after the great Prince Svatoslav, or Svaineld in Old Norse, with his retinue managed to destroy the mighty Khazar Khaganate and thus to become the strongest force in the steppe, it didn't took too long for another Turkic horde to appear and become a threat. Even after the great princes such as Vladimir, Yaroslav, Mstislav or Andrei built their great cities and churches in Kiev, Novgorod, Rostov, Vladimir, Chernigov and others, these cities were not impenetrable citadels of civilization, but rather were under constant threat of raids and warfare, both with nomadic hordes and among the princes themselves. Thus, there was always an acute understanding of vulnerability and impermanence of our achievements, our culture, and our civilization in general. You can find this particular idea expressed in the earliest examples of our architecture and literature. The dome of a Russian church is very different from a Byzantine one. It is not a circular, overwhelming structure symbolizing cosmos and order under God, but it is rather shaped similar to a candle, which burns bright and illuminates the world with his light, yet is also very delicate and fragile. The two famous early Russian literary pieces, The Tale of Igor's Campaign and Zadonshina, both tells a strikingly similar and very tragic story about how vulnerable our civilization really is in the face of nomad invaders and constant rivalry between the Rurikovich princes. The two epic tales are filled with sorrow and grief over the many brave men who perished both in the never-ending struggle against the steppe as well as the senseless fratricidal conflicts. Still, despite this fragility, despite this tragic sense of vanity and fatalism, or maybe because of them, our civilization was able to regenerate and return after a total annihilation, after being sent to the depths of hell by the thundering hooves of the Mongol hordes. It was able to return and to learn from its mistakes. The unknown authors of the aforementioned great texts harshly condemn the internal warfare and egotistical pursuits of the princes at the expense of the state's and people's lives and well-being. A deep yearning for unification and centralization can be found even in the pre-invasion tale of the Igor's Campaign, but it truly permeates Zadonshina and many later works of medieval Russian literature. And yet, when the princes of Moscow unified what was left of the old Russian lands, when the Russian man shrugged and threw off the Mongol yoke, when the long-desired independence was achieved, there was very little joy among our people. We understood too well what that meant. There could be no triumphant victory over the steppe. There could be very little in terms of glorious conquests. In order to defeat the steppe, one had to tame it. And so, it was with a great sense of reluctance and a heavy heart when our people started their slow and toilsome march into the great steppe. Our people, akin to a famous bogatyr Ilya Muromets, a hero of the old Russian folk tales, after being asleep for many years, finally woke up and, however unwillingly, went into the great steppe to tame it, to make it safe, to make it ours. Its vastness scared us at first. Its harshness was difficult to overcome, yet we persisted and persevered because we had to. Further and further east, farther away from our home, we chased the nomad thread, and eventually we ended up in Siberia. And it was even more harsh, and it was even more vast. Yet we persisted, because we had to. And in the end, we tamed it. We reached the end of the world, and the East was ours, as far as the eye can see. It was unwelcoming. It was empty and cold. It was up to us to civilize these lands, to bring the light of God to these empty spaces. And as hard as it was, we did it, because we had to. This sense of uneasiness, reluctance, and fatalism is what shapes the Russian soul. You can hear it in many traditional Russian songs and marches, yet I would like to point out the March of the Siberian Rifleman. In a way, it is very reminiscent of the ancient Orthodox chants and hymns. This piece, together with its other versions, highlights the feeling of heavy burden and the harsh conditions in which the Russian soul was shaped. In this song, you can hear the unstoppable mass of the Russian people resolutely marching forward despite all the obstacles. Yet this fatalism also has a different side to it, which can also be found in the famous Russian song called Kalinka, among others. Just like in toil and hardships, a Russian man gives himself whole, so does he in carousing. He can drink and party as if there is no tomorrow, as if it's the last time. And deep down, through his blood, he knows it could have well been the last time, before another nomad raid.